Good morning. I'm Eugene. I'm one of the pastors here. And I know it's not smart to sort of overhype yourself before you come up to preach. But I want to start by saying that I've never looked forward to preaching any sermon as much as this one that I'm about to preach today. Why? You may ask. At the risk of sounding too much like an infomercial, today I get to share about something that has changed my life. I've been a follower of Jesus for most of my adult life, and it's not an exaggeration to say that I have grown more spiritually in the last 2.5 years than in all of my years as a Christian combined. And so I'm excited to share my journey with you all today. And some of this might sound familiar because I've been sharing some of the things that I've been learning and processing in small pieces at a time over the past several years. But today I get to offer a proper introduction to this stream of spirituality that has been, for me, a paradigm shift, a source of new life for me. This has actually really rescued me in a very deep and powerful way. I'm sure many of you, especially those who might be optometrists, you might be aware that we require both eyes in order to perceive depth. If you close one eye, it may still seem like you can see things just fine, but once you actually try to do something like catch a ball or reach out for something, you'll realize in a possibly awkward or painful manner that you are actually half blind. And this is how I would describe my spiritual life until just a few years ago, when I realized that I'd been walking around with one eye closed my entire life. And I discovered that there is much more depth and breadth to God than I had ever imagined. And all this happened in just the nick of time. For some of you, this might be a little unnerving to hear your pastor say this, but about 3 years ago, I was in the midst of a faith crisis. Yes, pastors have faith crises too. I was tired. I was burnt out from ministry, wondering who I was and why I'm here. I simply felt like I had reached the limit of how far my own spirituality could take me. And it's not the kind of thing where I doubted that God was there. It was more that I doubted my view of him. I found that my way of understanding and relating to God was inadequate for the reality that I was experiencing. I felt like I was missing something. See, I did all the things that good Christians are supposed to do. I prayed, I studied the Bible, I served, I worshiped. I'm kind of a professional Christian, right? But I still had too many unresolved questions. I found that I still lacked the character to break out of the unhealthy patterns in my life. I still struggled with feeling spiritually inadequate and incomplete. And when I looked at the state of the world and all the brokenness in me and all around me and even in Christianity in general and the church, I couldn't help but wonder, God, what are we doing wrong? Where are you? And simplistic solutions and pat answers stopped working for me a long time ago. I needed more. Have you ever been there? Maybe that's where you are right now. Or maybe you've been a Christian for a long time and you've gotten used to low expectations. You're more or less settled into a religious routine. But deep down, you wonder, is this it? Is this all there is? And you sense deep down that there must be more. And that longing for more is one of the reasons that we're doing this sermon series in which we're exploring some of the rich and varied traditions of the Christian faith. Each of these traditions is an expression of biblical and historic faith, but like different styles of music, they express different cultures and experiences, like different wines. They express different flavors of who God is and how we can relate to him. And because we're limited to our own life experiences, many of us have only been exposed to one or two traditions. But through this series, we're hoping to introduce you to some new ones that you may not know much about. Why? because we worship a big God who cannot ever be fully known and expressed through only one tradition alone. And so today I'm excited to share with you about contemplative spirituality. Like most traditions we have today, this took shape after the Bible was written, so you're not going to find the words contemplative spirituality in the Bible. Rather, this is the result of the Holy Spirit working in the church throughout the centuries, from the 3rd and 4th century desert fathers and mothers to the mystics in the Middle Ages, from Eastern Christianity to modern teachers like Thomas Keating and Thomas Merton. For some reason, they're all named Thomas. Contemplative spirituality is just another name for what others might call Christian mysticism. And I know what you're thinking. Mysticism? Like this? Or this? Unfortunately, no. When we say mysticism, we don't mean magic or sorcery. We mean mysticism as in the word mystery or the unknown. And that's a good starting point for what sets contemplative spirituality apart from others. There are a lot of misconceptions about Christian mysticism, like it's some kind of weird, wacky, thing. But put simply, it starts with seeing God as great and mysterious. The prophet Isaiah reminds us, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. While some traditions focus on what we know about God through his revelation, like the scriptures and creation and the Bible and tradition, mysticism starts with the assumption that, listen to this part, whatever we think of God, by virtue of God being infinite and unfathomable, cannot actually be God, because he's always bigger, always deeper, always wider. Thomas Merton, contemporary contemplative teacher, said, "So much depends on our idea of God. Yet, no idea of him, however pure and perfect, is adequate to express him as he really is. Our idea of God tells us more about ourselves than about him." I went to both Bible college and seminary, and naturally, being in the academic tradition of the Western Enlightenment, the focus was on knowledge and reason, which are essential to our understanding of God. However, if the only way we're approaching God is through our ability to know and understand him with our minds, it would be like walking around with one eye closed. God designed us to know and love him with our whole selves, not just our minds, but with every part of who we are. And so it turns out that there is a whole other hemisphere, a whole other tradition of knowing and relating to God that I never learned much about in seminary or in the churches that I've been a part of. And you can see from this slide that there are actually two ways of knowing God, two pathways. Both are necessary. Both are even complementary to one another. We need to know the truth about God based on revelation and reason. That is the Western scholastic approach that most of us will be familiar with. But the Eastern mystics knew that God could not be accessed with the mind alone. See, without mystery, the Western scholastic approach can turn into a kind of hubris and reduces God to the size of our brains, which is not that big. But without revelation, the Eastern mystic approach alone can turn into just this vague spirituality devoid of substance. Both approach God in different ways. Both complete and correct each other. Both, I believe, are needed for healthy spirituality. We need both eyes to see the depth and breadth of God fully. In fact, the mystics teach that true knowing can only come after two necessary stages. First, knowledge, which says, I know. Then, wisdom, which says, I don't know anything. And so what does this mean? How does this play out in our lives? Well, it means we can seek answers and not need to have all the answers. We can try to get God as right as we can and also not have to be right all the time. We can be confident in the truth revealed in Jesus and humble enough to recognize that there's still so much we don't know, so much we don't understand. It means I can share what I know and the work that God has done in my life and not feel the need to be defensive or competitive with others. It makes a difference. Contemplatives embrace and welcome the mystery of God. Richard Rohr writes, a mystery isn't something we can't understand. It's something we can understand endlessly. That's deep, right? It means no matter how much we know about God, there's always more, always deeper layers of meaning, always deeper love and truth to discover. So I've used this example before. If a scientist were to think he or she already knows all there is to know about something, they will stop looking. They'll stop being curious. They'll stop learning and wondering and probing further. But a good scientist will keep learning because they know there is no end to all they could know. And this will drive them to keep looking and discovering new things. Mystery isn't the limit to what we know. It's actually the path to endless knowing. The word contemplate simply means to look at. To look at for a long time, or to gaze at attentively, or to seek that which is hidden or unseen. Without mystery, we might think we know it all, and so we'll stop looking, we'll stop gazing. We'll be blinded by our own biases and judgments. We'll deny contradictions and look away from things we can't understand. Because nobody looks for something they've already found, something that they've already figured out. To be a contemplative means to always be looking. To be a contemplative means to dive into the deep water of the mystery of God. It's being open to surprises and being open to being wrong and not having the full picture. It means to always be in awe of this great and mysterious God who cannot ever be fathomed. In the verses that were read for us earlier, David seems to have written this song out of a contemplative moment. He writes, "My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me." See, David is expressing a humility. He's basically saying, I know there are things I don't know and don't understand, and I have tried. I won't assume my eyes always see so clearly. I won't concern myself with matters too great or wonderful for me. He seems to have come to a place of acceptance of his own limitations, which is a hard thing for many of us to do because we want answers. People often ask me in various situations, whether it's about making a hard decision or facing a relational problem or even in a time of crisis, Pastor Eugene, what do I do? We want there to be a clear black and white answer. What's the right thing to do? What does God want me to do? And sometimes the answer is quite clear, but often it's not. Often there is no way of knowing for sure what is the perfectly right thing to do. And it's moments like these that reveal whether our spirituality is adequate for the mysteries and ambiguities of real life or not. Contemplation practices, invites us to sit in the unknown. At the same time, it invites us to know that we are not alone, but always in the presence of God. And this is an essential piece, an essential component of contemplative spirituality, that God is not absent just because the way looks unclear or he seems silent. Contemplation teaches us he's actually present in the silence. We only need to shed our agendas and anxieties so that we can meet him there. It's like standing in an open field, empty-handed, so that we can be fully present and aware of his presence with us. So in this way, this next verse captures the spirit of the contemplative tradition. David says, "But I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content." While many forms of spirituality emphasize doing and thinking and feeling something, mystics are drawn to calm and quiet. But it's not that contemplatives are just boring people. It is a calm and quiet that is rooted in deep union with God. David paints this image. When a child is nursing, she experiences a deep connection with her mother, who provides for her needs in a most intimate way. But a weaned child must learn a deeper kind of trust. That even in the absence of that sensory experience and that direct experience, she must learn to trust in the mother's love and provision. A child in the process of weaning might fuss and complain that satisfaction doesn't come immediately or even in the way that she wanted. But a weaned child is content, secure, at peace, content in the bond of love that she shares with her mother, and she trusts in her provision. So as a result, she can be calm and quieted. In this way, David perfectly captures this image of a contemplative posture before God. It's learning to find the motherly presence of God, even when God seems absent. When the way is dark and lonely, it's learning not to run away from the darkness, but to seek God in it. Seek God in the shadow. It's peering into the darkness, to look, to gaze long enough for your eyes to adjust and see that God is right there with you, and he has been the entire time. It's trusting and resting in God without all the stimulation and noise that so often captures our attention. It's finding God in mystery so that all of life, both the good and the bad, can be lived in this union with him. It's training our eyes to be captivated by this ever-present beauty, God's ever-present beauty in all things. And you never tire of gazing at beauty. When I reached the limit of myself several years ago, and I was, in the midst of my faith crisis, I fussed and complained. I was like an unweaned child. I demanded that God meet me and provide what I wanted when I wanted it. I wanted answers. I wanted to figure things out. God, what should I do? God, why doesn't this make sense? God, just fix me. Fix my life. Fix all these things that are broken. I was kind of like a bratty kid. But God is a patient mother. It was around this time when I was on a sabbatical, a much-needed sabbatical. And so another pastor friend of mine invited me to come along on a trip to spend a weekend with Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest and contemporary teacher of contemplative spirituality. And that weekend set me on a journey. It changed my life. It was my first introduction to contemplative spirituality, the other hemisphere. And it was like I opened my other eye for the first time, perceiving depth and a whole other dimension to my walk with God that I'd been missing. I began a journey of learning to let go and to find God in surrender, and discover that when I calm and quiet myself, God is already present, and He has been the whole time. I'm the one who's been absent. More than anything else, contemplative spirituality is about a posture before God that is not demanding or impatient. It's about surrender and stillness. It is a long, loving gaze into a mother's eyes, seeing her gaze mirrored back at you with this profound, unwavering love. There are no words exchanged, yet something powerful is happening. Something powerful and deep is being communicated. It's this kind of union that transcends words and reason. This union with Jesus, the Bible describes as something that can never be broken or severed. What's usually missing is enough stillness in us to be aware that our Heavenly Father is already there gazing at us with delight and love all the time. It's that simple. When someone asks you how to grow spiritually, you generally don't say, well, stop trying so hard. It doesn't make much logical sense, but most mysteries don't at first. You don't have to strive or strain, or learn any new tricks, or feel anything, or grasp some deep theological insight. You literally just have to do nothing but calm and quiet yourself like a weaned child and gaze into the Father's eyes, to be present, which is a lot harder than it sounds, because we tend to be addicted to doing and thinking and feeling things. Isn't that a sign that there must be something we might be running from or trying to avoid? Perhaps we're terrified of nothingness because we're afraid that without all the stuff we do, we won't be anything. But that is a lie. You are something. Let me tell you what you are and who you are. You are loved. That is your essence. If God is love and He made you in His image, then what does that make you? I love this quote from Thomas Merton. To say that I am made in the image of God is to say that love is the reason for my existence. For God is love. Love is my true identity. Selflessness is my true self. Love is my true character. Love is my name. So if God is love, then relationship is the key. If relationship is the key, then the secret to the spiritual life is to be present. The mystics teach that you can never not be in the presence of God because Christ is already and always all around you, with you and in you. He's always present. God is the great I am. He's present with you here and now. The question is, are you? Because our minds hate the present. Often our minds are so full of clutter. We are dwelling in the past, or we are anxious about the future, or we are judging and evaluating the present. And we find it extremely difficult to actually be present with God in the here and now. And that is why mystics focus on practices that that enable us to calm and quiet ourselves, enough to become aware of God's presence. Practices like silence and solitude, which are two central components of contemplative spirituality. Luke tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. If Jesus needed to get away from crowds and distractions so he could spend time with his heavenly Father, then surely so do we. And at first, I understand it seems a little too simple. And it may be hard to believe that just being alone and quiet could yield anything other than boredom and, maybe the urge to take a nap. But once I started practicing it, it's hard to describe, but it's kind of like doing an exercise you've never done before and discovering you had muscles in places you never knew you had. In the same way, practicing contemplation is sort of like exercising spiritual muscles you never knew you had. And it takes time to get used to. And you probably won't notice a change in one day, and most of you will probably hate it at first, just like most exercise. But with consistency and with practice, you will notice something happening in you. When we practice communing with God in silence and nothingness, then it becomes easier to find God in all the other moments of your day. You'll find that God is nearer to you in both mountaintops and valleys and everything in between. Over time, I find myself being more centered, more deeply connected with God than ever before, because I've done the spiritual discipline of finding God in nothing, in silence. I am in the process of learning how to be calm and quiet, less dependent, less anxious, secure, at peace, like a weaned child. And so here's how to do it. And this is the part where you're all kind of looking at me like, really? That's it? Find a moment in your day to be in silence and solitude. Put away your phone, put away your work, or any other distractions as far as possible for you. You can close your eyes or you can focus your attention on something that won't be too distracting. And here's the trick. Don't do anything. If you ever tried that, you'll know how hard that actually is. Some of you might be wondering, how in the world can that be spiritual? Don't I have to say or do, or feel something? No. If you find your mind wandering, use a centering word or a phrase to gently bring you back into the presence of God, like Jesus or Abba Father or some other short phrase of Scripture. It's simply removing distractions so that we can be quietly attentive to God. Some of you are listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, this sounds like the worst thing ever. That's probably why you need to do it. Because you're afraid that if you do nothing, if you actually let yourself rest in silence and be with God, you're afraid that there's nothing there. But I can assure you, God is there. God will be with you. Try it. Why is the silence so important? Because silence helps us quiet our thoughts and feelings. Without silence, our prayers tend to become our thoughts and feelings. Instead of actually relating and connecting with God and being present with Him, we fill our prayers with agendas and anxieties and fears, or our need to please others, or our need to please God and justify ourselves, or our need to avoid pain and discomfort and the unknown. So we push words at Him and believe we're praying, but in fact, we are missing God because our list of demands get in the way of actually hearing Him, of actually seeing Him. The antidote is silence. The only way to listen is to stop talking. And I'm sure all of us can relate to being physically with someone but not really being present. We might even look like we are engaged listeners on the outside, but our minds are elsewhere. And I've been guilty of this many times, with none of my meetings with you, of course, but, when I see Alice after a long day, I'm usually just tired, and self-absorbed and distracted, and I can't give her my full attention. Often what I need to do is just have 5 minutes of quiet to let myself, let the clutter in my mind settle down. And so I encourage you to start there. 5 minutes. You can set a timer. Then as you get more comfortable, try to extend that time by another 5 minutes and so on until you can be comfortable with longer periods. I promise you it will feel unproductive. But something deep will be happening in that space. When you remove all the other things that get in the way, what you are left with is just you and God. And you will train your eyes to see Him more present, more evident in all the areas of your life. If you really want to dive deep, arrange a day or several, if possible, for you to be alone with minimal demands and distractions. I find that in busy seasons, it generally takes 1 to 2 whole days by myself just to get to a point where all the voices in my head clamoring for my attention have quieted down. I've also found that if I don't actually plan it and carve out time for God, it's difficult for me to ever find it. And so I want to ask you, what does it look like for you in your life to prioritize silence and being present to God enough to make time for it in your day or on your calendar? Perhaps you can build a pattern of silence and solitude once a month, or in your life for an extended time once a year. The contemplative masters took off for years at a time, which is a little bit of a reach, but you could start somewhere. And so contemplative prayer isn't just about silence and solitude. Okay? That is just the beginning. The natural extension of meeting God in silence and solitude is to then cultivate our awareness of God's presence in all things. If we can meet God in the desert, in nothingness, in silence and solitude, then you can meet God anywhere. We too often compartmentalize our spiritual lives from what we might think is just mundane existence, right? Or perhaps even parts of our lives we don't want God to be a part of. But practicing the presence of God is inviting Him into the mundane, seeing Him in all things, inviting Him into every moment, every detail of our lives, the big and the small, the good and the bad. It can transform everything. It's looking for God. It's asking, where is God in this blessing or in this suffering or even in this neutral moment? Where is God when I'm eating breakfast or sitting in a chair or laughing with friends? Where is God in my anger and my pain? Where is God in joy and fun? Where is God in the people that I disagree with? There is no circumstance, no experience that doesn't have God hidden in it somewhere. All we have to do is train our eyes to see. Because every moment has something to teach us. God is present. God is present when you're nervous going into a job interview. God is present when you're caring for a sick parent. God is present when your crying baby wakes you up in the middle of the night. God is present all around us. God is present and working in the people that you work with and our neighbor across the street. How might you see differently and act differently and pray differently, knowing that God is everywhere and in everything? Another awesome quote from Thomas Keating, he quotes St. Teresa of Avila, and he says, "All difficulties in prayer can be traced to one cause, praying as if God were absent." And he continues, "This is the conviction that we bring with us from early childhood and apply to everyday life and to our lives in general. It gets even stronger as we grow up, unless we are touched by the gospel, the good news, and begin the spiritual journey." And it is how he describes the spiritual journey. It's this process of dismantling the monumental illusion that God is distant or absent. Christ can be found anytime, anywhere, doing anything. So instead of just seeing Jesus once in a while or only when you're engaged in religious activities, practicing the presence of God is seeing God in everything and seeing everything in God. He becomes the lens through which we see all. And one way this has made a difference in my life is that I now treasure moments of boredom. I treasure moments of downtime. I used to feel restless or anxious that I wasn't optimizing my time, and I would pull out my phone to distract myself or check email or try to be productive in some way every chance I got. But now, I don't mind waiting in line for groceries anymore, or doing mundane tasks like doing dishes, or even sitting in Boston traffic, because every moment I get when I'm forced to slow down and do nothing is nothing but a golden opportunity to meet with Jesus, to spend time with Him. Now when I see people or meet someone for the first time, I'm learning to train my eyes to look beyond appearances and see Jesus in them. When I encounter an awkward situation or a difficult decision or a tedious task, I can welcome it with hope and joy and peace, because it's just another opportunity to meet with Jesus, because He's there too. If you want to learn more about inviting God into your everyday life, I suggest reading this book by, if you haven't already, by Brother Lawrence. He's a 7th century monk. It's called The Practice of the Presence of God. And this happens to be available for free on Kindle, so you have no excuse. Obviously, there is so much more that we can delve into. It's just an introduction. We're just scratching the surface. But if your curiosity has been piqued, I want to offer you something. I want to personally invite you to come try out one of our Anchor gatherings. Often people will ask, what is that? And what happens there? Well, Anchor is a contemplative spiritual community. It's a group of people who simply gather to meet with Jesus. And you don't have to be any particular age or gender or have some marital status. It's a space that is open to anyone. And what do we do there? We usually sit in a circle, we gather in a round, and we light a candle in the middle of the room. And that is simply, it's not magic or anything. It's just simply to signify that Christ is the center of this gathering. And we worship through liturgy and song. I often share some aspect of the contemplative journey, and we talk about it. And then we engage in spiritual practices, and we share our experiences. And I know I'm biased, but I believe it's one of the best places to see Jesus in our church. And so, join us one of these times, and you can reach out to me if you have any questions about that. I often say contemplation is the spirituality that so many of us need. We just don't know it yet. It is a relearning of how we see God, ourselves, and reality, and it has transformed my life, my ministry, and even my marriage. And I recognize that it might not be for everyone, but for anyone seeking more, especially in our hurried and noisy and distracted and overbusy lives, it can be a pathway to a very different kind of awareness and oneness with God. And so I'm eager to share more with you, perhaps at another time. But for now, I like to close by inviting us to actually practice silence for just a few moments. So I invite us to make ourselves comfortable in our seats, and perhaps you can close your eyes. And together, let's take a long, slow, deep breath. Let's do that now together. There's no need to strive or strain. Simply rest into the loving presence of God like a weaned child. Lord, we are content. Teach us to be still. Teach us to rest. Teach us to be present. We'll spend a few more moments in silence, and Pastor Dave will come and lead us in response.